A federal judge was on her way to her niece's wedding in Birmingham, Alabama. She looked like any ordinary woman, driving her Honda Civic without government plates or security escorts, just like any other person. As she got closer to the small town of Fairfield, she spotted a police checkpoint up ahead. A few officers stood along Highway 78, and in the center was Sergeant Devin Mitchell in full uniform. He motioned with his hand for her to pull over. She eased her car to the side of the road and stopped. With a firm voice, the sergeant asked, "Where are you headed, ma'am?" The woman calmly answered, "I'm on my way to my niece's wedding." Sergeant Mitchell gave her a long look. She was a 52-year-old, respected black woman named Judge Raina Washington. With a mocking laugh, he said, "Oh, off to eat and drink at your niece's wedding, huh? But you were speeding through our town, and that seatbelt doesn't look right either. Come on now, you'll need to pay a fine." Sergeant Mitchell pulled out his citation pad. Raina immediately realized what his true motive was, and that this was nothing but a pretext. She said, "Officer, I haven't broken any traffic rules." "Don't try to school us on the law, lady," he snapped. He glanced at a deputy beside him, then looked back at Raina and added, "Looks like we need to teach her some respect." Without warning, the sergeant seized Raina's arm roughly. "Too much attitude, huh? When the police speak, you're supposed to just obey quietly." Pain shot through her arm under his grip, but she stayed composed. Her eyes burned with anger, yet she said nothing. Sergeant Mitchell smirked and said, "Still got that defiance in those eyes. I've handled plenty like her before. Time for a real lesson." A deputy stepped forward and said, "Sarge, let's take her down to the station. We'll give her the full treatment there. That'll teach her how to talk to officers." Another deputy snatched Raina's purse and barked, "Come on, get in the car." Raina jerked back and snapped, "Don't you dare lay your hands on me, or you'll regret it." The sergeant's anger boiled higher. He muttered to a deputy, "See that arrogance?" One officer grabbed Raina Washington's shoulder and tried to force her toward the squad car. She cried out, but still refused to reveal who she was. She wanted to see just how far they were willing to go. One officer, losing his temper, kicked the car door hard and shouted, trying to act all superior, "Huh? Now you'll learn what happens when someone disrespects the badge." Judge Raina Washington instantly grasped the situation. She now knew exactly how far these men were willing to sink. Rage burned in Sergeant Mitchell's eyes as he yelled, "I've seen plenty of clever ones like you pass through Fairfield. You think you can challenge the police today? We'll make sure you regret it. Take her to the station, we'll deal with her there." Yet Judge Washington stayed silent. She gave no sign of revealing who she really was. She wanted to witness just how far they would go in misusing their authority. How deep would their corruption run? Mitchell's frustration was growing. In front of him stood a woman who had been shoved, grabbed, and even had her car kicked, yet she still carried herself with unshaken dignity. No pleading, no outbursts. The sergeant thought to himself, "Once she's at the station, I'll find a way to break this defiant woman." His anger wasn't just surface level, it was fury boiling inside. He sneered and said, "Now she's gone quiet. Fine, let's get her to the station. We'll see how long she stays quiet there." When they reached the Fairfield police station, Sergeant Mitchell shouted loudly, "Where is everybody? We've got ourselves a special guest today, one who needs her attitude straightened out." Judge Washington remained wordless. She simply kept her eyes on the station walls, noting how innocent people must have been treated here when they dared to resist. One deputy leaned close to Sergeant Mitchell and quietly asked, "What should we charge her with, Sarge?" Mitchell shrugged and replied casually, "Speeding, no seatbelt, resisting arrest, put down whatever you want. The point is to break her spirit. Don't ask too many questions." Raina heard every word, yet she still stayed silent. It was almost as if she wanted their own voices to reveal the truth of their abuse. The sergeant sat behind his desk, tapping a pen against the metal top, then raised his eyes toward her and asked, "Name? Address? Who's bailing you out?" Raina didn't respond. He repeated more firmly, "Didn't you hear me? What's your name?" But her silence stood firm, like a wall. Suddenly, Mitchell slammed his hand down on the desk so hard that the sound echoed through the station. Shouting in fury, he demanded, "Didn't you hear me? Tell me your name right now." Slowly, Raina turned her head and calmly answered, "Mrs. Sarah Johnson." The sergeant narrowed his eyes and sneered, "Oh, clever, aren't you? Used to lying to cops, huh? But remember, if you think you're too smart, it'll cost you. One mistake, and you won't even get a chance to regret it." Judge Washington was then shoved roughly into a filthy holding cell where two other women were already sitting. One of them glanced at her and asked, "Sister, what did they lock you up for?" Raina gave a faint smile but said nothing. She was only taking in how rotten the entire system had become. If a federal judge could be jailed without reason, what hope did ordinary citizens have? She now sat in the corner of that dim cell, quietly watching, listening, and absorbing every corrupt act unfolding around her. Meanwhile, Sergeant Mitchell fabricated a false report, declaring, "Charge her with disturbing the peace, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct." He slammed his hand against the file and barked, "Get this processed fast." One deputy hesitated and said, "But Sarge, we don't have any." "But Sarge, we don't have any real proof for these charges," one deputy muttered. The sergeant let out a laugh and said, "In this station, evidence isn't collected, it's created." Moments later, a deputy came in and yanked Raina by the arm. Just as Mitchell was about to continue his abuse, a firm voice came from the doorway, "What's going on here?" Everyone turned their heads. At the entrance stood Captain Jerome Williams. His reputation was slightly better than the rest of the department. He stepped inside, his brow furrowing as he noticed the woman's condition. "What's happening here?" he demanded. Mitchell gave a nervous grin and replied, "Nothing, Captain. Just some lady from Birmingham acting too clever. We're teaching her some respect." Captain Williams studied Raina closely. Something about her composure didn't match that of an ordinary citizen. He asked, "What are the charges?" Mitchell hesitated before answering, "Sir, she was speeding and got aggressive during the stop." Williams's suspicion grew. He turned to Raina and asked, "Ma'am, what's your name?" She stayed silent. Mitchell chuckled and added, "Captain, she won't even give us her real name. Been lying since we brought her in." At that, Captain Williams became sharply attentive. He ordered firmly, "Put her in a separate cell. I'll question her myself." Mitchell looked startled, but Williams cut him off with a stern reply, "I'll handle this personally." On his command, Raina was moved into another cell, smaller and more isolated than the first. She glanced around. In one corner sat a broken bench, and the air was thick with the stench of despair. Now, even more clearly, she was seeing the true face of this corrupt system. With every passing moment, Raina understood more clearly how justice had been reduced to nothing but paperwork and power struggles. Suddenly, a deputy rushed in, shouting, "Captain, there's a convoy of black vehicles outside." Mitchell froze. "What kind of vehicles?" he demanded. The deputy answered nervously, "Sir, federal government cars." Mitchell darted outside, and the instant he saw the convoy, his eyes went wide with shock. He hurried back in and whispered frantically to Captain Williams. Annoyed, Williams asked, "What is it? Who's here?" The deputy, his voice trembling, replied, "Sir, it's the U.S. Attorney General." Mitchell's face drained of all color, and even Captain Williams stiffened. The situation had now escalated to the very top of federal authority. A moment later, the Attorney General stepped into the station, his expression burning with anger. Fixing his eyes on Mitchell, he demanded sharply, "Sergeant Mitchell, what kind of operation are you running in this place?" Flustered and sweating, Mitchell stammered, "Nothing unusual, sir. Just routine police work." The Attorney General snatched the arrest file from the desk and began to read it carefully. The Attorney General's forehead creased with a deep frown as he studied the file. Then he glanced toward the holding cells and asked, "Who is the woman you arrested?" Mitchell answered quickly, "Sir, just some troublemaker who refused to cooperate during a traffic stop." The Attorney General's tone hardened. "Do you have any valid evidence for these charges?" He repeated more forcefully, "Do you have any evidence at all?" Mitchell had no reply. He was cornered. Without another word, the Attorney General walked straight to the cell and asked the woman, "Ma'am, what is your name?" For the first time, Judge Raina Washington allowed herself a faint smile and said, "The Honorable Judge Raina Washington, Federal District Court, Northern District of Alabama." A heavy silence fell across the station. Faces went pale, deputies froze in disbelief, and Mitchell's hands and knees shook uncontrollably. The floor seemed to vanish beneath him. The woman he thought was just another black citizen to intimidate was in fact the federal judge presiding over the entire Northern District of Alabama. She was not just anyone, she was Judge Raina Washington herself. The same woman they had dragged on the roadside, the same woman whose car they had kicked, the same woman thrown into a filthy cell like a criminal. And the moment her true identity was revealed, chaos swept through the station. Deputies stood motionless in shock, while the Attorney General turned his piercing gaze directly at Mitchell. The Attorney General glared at Sergeant Mitchell and thundered, "Mitchell, how dare you file false charges against a federal judge?" Mitchell opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Captain Williams, standing nearby, interjected loudly, "Sir, I told them from the start something about this arrest didn't feel right." Mitchell now stood completely alone. Then Judge Washington, in a calm yet commanding voice, delivered her judgment, "Sergeant Mitchell, your career in law enforcement is finished. You are under arrest for civil rights violations, unlawful detention, and abuse of power." At those words, Mitchell felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. The other deputies turned their faces away in shame. Captain Williams immediately barked, "Deputy Johnson, place him under arrest and read him his rights." But before the deputy could move, Mitchell pulled a folded document from his pocket and smirked. "Wait, Your Honor. Look at this first before you do anything else." He held out the paper. Both the Attorney General and Judge Washington fixed their eyes on him. Mitchell continued, "This is my retirement paperwork. I submitted it 3 days ago. So no matter how furious you are, you can't touch my pension." Once again, silence spread across the station. Judge Washington took the document and examined it carefully. The Attorney General narrowed his gaze and ordered Captain Williams, "Verify this." Williams quickly checked the records on the computer, then lifted his head. "Sir, it's genuine. But his retirement doesn't take effect for another week. That means he was still on duty when these crimes were committed. His pension is now void, and he will face federal charges." Judge Washington locked eyes with Mitchell and said firmly, "Your new residence will be the same kind of cell where you placed innocent people." The Attorney General nodded in agreement. As 2 deputies stepped forward to detain him, Mitchell made one last desperate move. "Wait, Your Honor. I'm not the only one guilty here. Do you think all the blame falls just on me?" He then pointed toward the other officers in the station and declared, "Half of them were part of this. We've been running the scheme for years." Several officers' faces drained of color. Captain Williams looked around at each of them, realizing just how deep the corruption went. Judge Washington turned to the Attorney General and said, "We're going to have to clean out this entire department. No one involved will be spared," Judge Washington declared. The Attorney General responded firmly, "As you recommend, Your Honor, everyone will be held accountable." The instant those words were spoken, it felt like a thunderclap shook the station. Outside, local reporters who had trailed the federal convoy began setting up their cameras, realizing something major was happening inside. When word spread that an entire police department was under investigation for civil rights violations, live broadcasts began immediately. A black SUV soon pulled up, and from it stepped the FBI special agent in charge. Surveying the tense scene of federal agents, local officers, and media crews, he asked the Attorney General, "How long has this corruption been running?" Both the Attorney General and Judge Washington stood grim-faced. Judge Washington turned directly to the agent and said, "Agent Davis, this investigation must go deeper. I believe this pattern of abuse extends far beyond this department." At once, Captain Williams pulled out a thick file and handed it to her. Inside was evidence of misconduct reaching into the county sheriff's office and even the district attorney's office. Holding the file, Judge Washington said to the agent, "Here, you'll find records of their corrupt practices. This goes much further than we imagined." Sweat formed on the FBI agent's forehead as he realized the scale of what was about to unfold. Without hesitation, the Attorney General raised his voice and declared, "I'm forming a federal task force to investigate civil rights violations across Jefferson County. Every officer and every official involved in this organized abuse will face federal charges." The station fell into stunned silence. For the first time, someone had openly challenged such deep-rooted corruption at the local level. The moment the federal investigation was announced, a wave of change swept through Jefferson County. The story exploded onto national news. CNN, NBC, and Fox News all covered the federal judge who exposed systemic police corruption by going undercover. Even the governor of Alabama was briefed, and from the state capitol came direct orders: cooperate fully with the federal investigation and ensure complete transparency. Within a week, more than 30 police officers, 8 sheriff's deputies, and 2 assistant district. Across Jefferson County, more than 30 police officers, 8 sheriff's deputies, 2 assistant district attorneys, and several city officials were placed under arrest. The entire power structure that had protected this corruption for decades began to collapse. The local community, long silenced under abuse, finally found its voice. Citizens stepped forward with accounts of harassment, false arrests, and cover-ups that had haunted them for years. Judge Washington's actions had gone far beyond exposing one crooked police department. She had dismantled an entire web of corruption that had oppressed her community. A new atmosphere settled over Jefferson County, one built on accountability, transparency, and true justice. The fear that had once kept people quiet was replaced by hope that the system could finally serve everyone. Judge Washington's mission was complete. She had shown that when someone with both courage and authority stands against corruption, even the most deeply rooted systems can be changed. Back at the federal courthouse in Birmingham, Judge Washington resumed her duties. But now, she carried the added respect of someone who had risked her own freedom to uncover injustice. The wedding she had been driving to that day was postponed because of the federal investigation. Yet, when it was finally held 2 months later, the entire community gathered, not only to celebrate the marriage, but to honor the bravery of the judge who had transformed their lives. In her chambers, Judge Washington kept a framed front page from the newspaper the day after the arrests. The headline read, "Federal Judge's Courage Exposes Decades of Police Corruption, 30+ Officials Arrested." She had come to understand that sometimes the most powerful must be willing to appear powerless in order to reveal the truth. Justice is not only about wearing the robe of authority, it is about standing with those who have none. If this story inspired you, and reminded you that one person's courage can change an entire system, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to know that justice is still possible. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the strength of standing up for what's right, even when the cost is high. Real change begins when those in power choose not to shield themselves, but to defend the people who cannot defend themselves.